So we're back, and thanks for everybody showing up. I hope you enjoyed the presentation last week and got something out of it. And if nothing else, that you'll remember that every measurement has error. So keep that in mind, because that's what we got to deal with, right? So this is from National Society of Professional Surveyors. For most states in the U.S., if you are a member of your state society, then you are a member of NSPS, the National Society. And hopefully California will be there soon. And we're working our way towards that. But for now, we're a participating organization rather than a represented organization, I think is the way it's called. So this is what we're trying to do with survey data adjustment. And it doesn't matter what kind of adjustment you're going to do. This is the way it's defined by NSPS. And if you're going to be taking the national exam, the NCEES professional surveyor exam, you should really get this book from NSPS. And I suggest that you go to your local professional society and you talk to them about doing a quantity buy, because you can get some number of books and bring the price down significantly by ordering 20 or 30 or 50 at a time. And if you've got a firm that's got 20 surveyors in the field, they all should have one of these. In fact, if I was starting my own firm, my onboarding, part of it would be, here is your copy of definitions of surveying and associated terms. So anyway, we're trying to remove the inconsistencies, the random errors, and applying derived corrections to compensate for those. And remember, not the systematic corrections, not the systematic errors, okay? So this is why we're adjusting this data, right? So that it's done, we do it per particular process, so that it's an accepted practice. So if I do an adjustment and I get a call from Trent, he doesn't say, well, how'd you do this? I said, I just decided to do this. Well, say, what are you, some kind of knucklehead? You don't do it that way, you bozo. Don't do that. That's not the industry standard, right? And part of it is that it reflects the expected error. Where is it that we're going to be more likely to have error than in one place than another? And in a manner that is repeatable, right? If we do have a same data set and we run that data set through a particular adjustment on Monday, if we adjust it using the same process and the same data set on Wednesday, we should get the same results, right? The key is that we'll reduce the effect of these random measurement errors on our final survey results. It's also so we can determine the precision and accuracy of the survey that we perform. And that would be just to see how we're doing. Are we doing quality work or are we not? Hey, Cap, now you got two. That's awesome. That's all right. Start them young. Start them young. That's good.
Hey, Rob, in my family, we call that a crew.
Exactly. Tony, some of you guys probably know Tony Cuomo. I think he was about 5 years old or 6 years old when his dad started taking him out onto projects. So, but ensure that we meet the standards that were required for whatever the project is, right? Here's a bunch of different ways to approach surveying adjustments. Right? If you run a level run from a benchmark to your project site and on to the next benchmark down the street, and you might go half a mile each from one benchmark to your site and another half a mile to the next benchmark, and you close for 1/100th of a foot, you might just ignore it and say, that's completely acceptable for what we're doing, right? Just to completely stay with your results generated in the field. Now, it does ignore the error, and it doesn't give you the ability to say or to show a statistical analysis of that, but closing flat is closing flat, right? Arbitrary, that was kind of the example that I gave where Trent says, hey, you don't do it that way. That's not the way to do it. It ignores the potential for error and where your error is creeping into your work. And then these other methods. Compass rule is probably the one that we all learned first as far as adjusting traverses. And then finally, least squares. It's the full statistical approach. It's the most complicated method, but we got these awesome things called computers, and they make a complex task like a big least squares network adjustment fairly not labor intensive compared to old school methods of doing these adjustments. And one of the keys about least squares is you can mix different accuracy and precision measurements. You can bring in different crews if your survey organization has different types of equipment, depending on which crew it is. You can bring those in and just assign an appropriate value to different instruments. And part of what you get from that least squares adjustment is a statistical report that shows that you meet certain specifications. For example, if you're doing a NSPS ALTA land title survey, then you have to use least squares software to do your control so that you can ensure that your specifications are met. Hang on just a second. Sorry, I was trying to cough there. It's bugging me. So let's consider just a simple triangular traverse, okay? If we have this traverse, we can use a least squares adjustment and the data will all be adjusted equitably. If the same instrument is used for the entire operation, the same procedures are used at each location. That means the same number of angular measurement sets are turned and the same number of distance measurements are performed. So if this is A, B, and C, right? You set up the same instrument as A, and at B, and at C, and the same system all the way throughout. The same instrument person, the same type of sites, the same everything, the same amount of care put into each setup, right? And you get the same angular standard deviations and distance all the way through, okay? If all that happens, then the data is going to be adjusted equitably, okay? Now, how likely is that to happen? Pretty unlikely, right? Because any change that you do to the system, remember going back to last week and we talked about those equations, right? If you change the number of measurements, you've changed the error at that location. Even if you get the same result, okay? So any differences will cause the amount of adjustment to change. So that's where we get into weighting, okay? Weighted adjustments, and assigning a weight is establishing a level of credibility or reliability or worth compared with other values of the same quantity. If you have two of anything, I don't care what they are, and you trust the information from one of them more than the other, you weight your assessment of that information accordingly. So, Kat, I see you got two kids there. If you walk into the dining room, and what's your little man's name?
It's Liam.
Okay, and you walk into the dining room and or into the kitchen, and you see the cookie jar lid is off, and there's no more chocolate chip cookies in the cookie jar.
Right.
And you walk into the TV room, and Liam's got chocolate all over his face.
Yeah.
And was that your daughter that was also there?
Yeah.
Right? And you say, who ate all the chocolate chip cookies? And both of them say, not me. Right? You're going to weight your analysis based on the evidence in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're going to weight your analysis based on the credibility of the information. So if you have a crew that has two instruments for some reason, and they have an old beat Topcon GTS 3B from about 1985, or they got the newest, fanciest Trimble XYZ 10,000 from 2021, because we don't want anything from 2020 at this point. Right? You probably have more credibility in that newer instrument with a higher level of accuracy specifications from the manufacturer and so forth, right? Or if you are simply looking at the same, say, Trimble S6, they come in 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, and 5 second specification instruments. Well, a 2 second instrument versus a 5 second instrument, clearly you should get better data from the 2 second instrument, all other things being equal, okay? So we weight the measurements in our adjustment. And so here's part of that concept, right? Account for different error sources, and or it can be based on those error sources or the quantity of the readings. So the number of measurements, as we learned last week, the more times we measure something, the more accurate that value becomes. Okay? So we can't talk about statistics without throwing a couple formulas in there. So this little symbol here that looks like, I don't know, looks kind of like an infinity symbol with part of the corner cut off or the edge cut off. It means proportional. Okay, so the weight is proportional to the error sources, but how? Well, it's 1 over the error sources squared, so it's inversely proportional. If there's more error sources, you give that less weight or less credibility. If the weight is also inversely proportional to the correction that you apply. If something is very credible or highly weighted, it gets very little correction. So a 2-second instrument would get less correction, all things being equal, compared to a 5-second instrument. So the amount of correction that you apply to those angles would be less for the 2-second instrument. Right? Because you're weighting that instrument higher. Now, the weight is proportional, not inversely, but directly proportional to the number of repeated measurements of that same value, whether it's an angle or a distance or whatever. The more you repeat it, the higher you weight that set of measurements. Okay? And it's inversely proportional, so the 1 divided by the number in a series of measurements. Okay? So I think we talked about taping last time, and we had to do a series of 100-foot pulls to get that 1,000-foot distance. Well, the more number in the series, the lower the weight. Okay? The lower the weight, the higher the correction. Okay? So with that, let's go back to that triangle that I had from the other slide and say, you have a 3-person crew, or maybe you have a 2-person crew, and the boss is going to come out and check on things. And the new person takes his or her vehicle out from the yard with the instrument, and the more experienced person, that might be Luz Garcia, she says, go get set up, go set up the back sights. We're going to start at A, you're going to back sight B, and you're going to measure to C. So set up the back sights. I'm going to hit Starbucks, and I'll pick you up a pumpkin latte, and we'll be on our way. Well, let's see, who's the new guy? Was it Chad? Chad's the new guy. He's all raring to go, and he wants to impress everybody. So he runs out there and he sets up his sights, and there must be a line at Starbucks because Luz is a little delayed in getting to him. So he sets the instrument up at A, and real quick he turns 2 sets and he measures the angle at A, and this is the value that he gets. Okay. And then Luz shows up, and he's already pulled the instrument off, and he's moved the sight kit from B over to A, and he's turned the sight kit at C, looking at B, and he's setting up the instrument here. And Luz says, what are you doing? I told you to start with A. He goes, hey, I already got A. But thanks for the latte. Right? And she goes, well, what'd you get? And he shows her the field book, and he says, I turned 2 sets, and I got this angle. And she says, oh, man, 2 sets, that's not what we typically do here. So turn 4 sets at B. Okay? And your splits were good, and everything looked good on this one. So you go ahead, keep running the instrument, turn 4 sets. And then Trent shows up, and they've finished A and they've finished B, and they're setting up at C, and they're moving the sight kit over to B, and they're turning the glass, because that's one of those things we got to remember to do when we move the instrument, is turn the glass to face the instrument. And Trent shows up and says, so what'd you accomplish so far? You guys look like you're, going like a house on fire here. And Lou says, well, Chad turned 2 sets at A, and then we moved to B, and he turned 4 sets there. And Trent says, well, let's see what happens if you turn 8 sets at C. And that's way more than we normally do, but we'll give it a whirl, right? So what do we know if we're turning the interior angles of a triangle? What do we know about these horizontal angles? Right? The sum of the interior angles of a closed figure should add up to
180.
180 for a triangle, and minus 2 times 180, right? So if we add those up, we see that here's the values that we started with. We come up 30 seconds short. So back in the old days, doing a compass rule adjustment, we'd simply balance the angles. We'd say 10 seconds off this one, 10 seconds off that one, 10 seconds off, or add 10 seconds, add 10 seconds, add 10 seconds, come up with 180 degrees, move it along, right? But that's the old ways, where we probably had a consistent number of angular measurements. And if you add these up, right, the 2 that Chad started with, the 8 that Trent had him do at the end, that's 10, and 4 more is 14. 2/14 of the total number of measurements were done from A. 4/14 of the total number of measurements were done from B. And 8/14 were done at C. Okay? Now, we can reduce these by dividing it in 2, right? Because the relative number of angles, 2 to 4 to 8, if we simplified that, that would be 1 to 2 to 4. Okay? And that's that's where you end up coming up with this 7. And I hate this part of this, but here's the key. The number is consistent with a higher weight. So C would be highest weighted, A would be lowest weighted, and B would be right in the middle. But if it's higher weighted, then the amount of correction is inversely proportional. So we take that 1 1/7, 2/7, and 4/7. And we changed their positions. So the 4/7 of the correction goes up here with A. 2/7 of the correction stays with B, and 1/7 of the correction stays with C, right? So the least amount of correction is with the highest weighted point. Chad, give me a nod if that's making sense, because I can see you and I can see Kat. Is that making sense? Kat, you with me on that? Okay. So I'm using you two as barometers for the rest of the group, because you're the only ones that are showing up on my screen. So our total amount of correction is we need to add 30 seconds to the whole network. So that 30 seconds times 4/7 gives us 17 seconds of angular adjustment here. 2/7 times that 30 seconds is 9 seconds of angular adjustment here. And 1/7 times that 30 seconds total is only 4 seconds of correction at point C. So C was the highest weighted because it had the largest number of measurements. And because of that, it has the least amount of correction applied to its angle. Okay, so we started out with 89/22/20 at C. It becomes 89/22/24. At B, a 47/12/34 with 9 seconds added becomes 47/12/43. And at A, 43/24/36 has the most correction applied because it was the lowest weighted. And that becomes a 43/24/53 for the adjusted angle value. And if you add these all up, you end up with 180 degrees. And we have successfully applied weighting based on number of angles, number of measurements to an angular figure, a triangular figure. Okay? So what do you think of that? Chad, does that make sense? Kat?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I don't see Sean's face, but I see a artwork of a dog. Sean, is that making sense to you?
It's a very cute dog, but yes, it's making sense.
And right, so that's kind of a simplistic way to explain weighting and to show an example. And this could be something that if you were going to be tested on an exam, they might say, here's the data set. What's the adjusted angle based on weighting these measurements? Simply based on number of measurements, right? And it might be, what's the angle at B, or what's the angle at A? Okay? So that's weighting. So when we go into least squares, it allows weighting observations, either by number of measurements or by accuracy of the data sets. It could be accuracy of the instrument. If you have different instruments using different instruments to do the data, compile all the data, or the individual set of measurements can be weighted higher. You get the rigorous analysis of these, and you're able to assess the quality and flag the outliers. And it's simultaneous. Okay. Back in the old days of compass rule adjustment, the first thing we did was angular adjustment. Then we went through and adjusted the distances. Okay. Least Squares software allows it to be simultaneous. You get detailed reporting of the results and the measurement uncertainties. And you can compare different, even record data sources to identify inconsistencies. It might have been before Luz's time at Fresno, but I remember going to a conference there and saw back-to-back presentations on StarNet software. And one was a surveyor in Southern California, basically crowdsourcing GPS static data and doing an amazing, huge compilation of static data results and adjustment in a particular location in Southern California. The other was a guy showing a method that he was using, StarNet, to help him develop search coordinates for boundary monument search. So here's entirely different applications of the Least Squares software, but it's there and it's available. So field procedures, right? How do we get your field work better? We're going to reduce the error size and the impact. This is key. We measure first and adjust last. The software is going to assume that the instruments are calibrated and the measurements are carefully made. If this isn't happening or this isn't happening, it's out the window, right? And then back in the old days, probably before Trent started surveying, but I know Michael Hank probably is aware because I think he's one of those 5-year-old field surveyors. And I'm sure Steve Parrish remembers strength of figure. Strength of figure is something that we really don't take into account that much. We don't give it the thought that we need to. And a new current issue surveying textbook might not really touch on strength of figure very much. But that's something to consider in your network, your control network scheme is, are you doing something that's doesn't have a good strength of figure to it? For example, something that we do here at Caltrans all the time is run a traverse in a mostly north-south direction or mostly east-west direction, because that's generally the direction of our routes. Our routes are linear. So if you just go off in a line where your angles are real close to 180 degrees at your traverse setups, your strength of figure is really poor. So there's ways to improve that, and that is have something else that you can incorporate into your traverse. One of my colleagues was involved with a survey in the Sierra foothills that went up a really steep hill. Depending on where you are, it's either a hill or a mountain. If we got some of those Florida surveyors down here, it's definitely a mountain. But this probably 2 or 3 mile long very windy little road, the distances that you could see from one point on the road to another to set the traverse control was so short that and their basically their angles were nearly 180 degrees from one to the other as they were just basically getting the outside of the curve as it went around the ridge on the way up the hill. And somebody said, hey, why don't we set a couple of turning points on the other side of this valley, about 2,000 feet away, that give us another set of control points. Hang on. Another set of control points that give us a longer sight distance. We can set a permanent site across the valley and have that be our back sites for several of these different points, or our pre-established checkpoints. So we can set up on any one of these, site one of those across the valley, and check the other one across the valley. By doing that, they were able to measure these 2 or 3 points on the other side of the valley from all the traverse points going up their route. So they had a lot of redundant measurements to those other points, and it made the network stronger. And then you got to have proper procedures. You got to follow those. And like we talked about last time, identify your blunders, remove those, and then identify if there's any systematic biases, and then account for those. And Chad, tell them you're busy taking a class. He's looking away from the camera. Somebody's talking at him. So here's some tips. Your instrument and your accessories have to be calibrated and in good order. I don't know if I told this story before, but one of my colleagues went to work for a firm, and as a party chief, and his first day he shows up, and they'd hired him, and he shows up, and they give him the instrument, and they introduce him to his chainman, and they give him the assignment to go out and do some work. And he said, okay, anything special about this instrument? Because sometimes there might be something special about how they want things done, or, you know, anything special about how you want things done, or about the instrument, or about how you want your data presented. And this is back in the day of handwritten field notes and that sort of thing. And the boss said, oh yeah, only turn your angles to the left. Don't turn any angles to the right. And he said, what? Okay, why? And he said, well, the party chief before you felled a small tree, cut down a small tree, and it hit the instrument and knocked it to the ground. And now the instrument doesn't turn angles to the right, it only turns to the left. And he said, well, what happened to the party chief? And they said, oh, we fired him because he dropped the tree on the instrument. And that's why we hired you. Now, wait a second, folks. Okay, Chad, you're my Cal Poly grad. If you're going to be a civil engineer, and are you going to feel comfortable with survey data that's generated from an instrument that has had a tree dropped on it and knocked to the ground and damaged to the point that it will not correctly read angles to the right, but apparently it does to the left. Do you want to risk your designs on the data that comes back from that? Or if
Definitely not.
Or if you're a surveyor and you're called into court for a boundary resolution and you're going up against, you know, somebody that might know something about boundary, like Steve freaking Parrish, who I believe is still on the call, right? And they say, hey, these notes, the other attorney says, these notes seem very strange, because Steve looked at the field book and said, why the hell did they turn all the angles to the left? And why is that, Mr. Keenan? And Trent has to say, well, because we dropped a tree on the instrument and it doesn't turn angles to the right anymore. It only turns them to the left.
Someone's already won the court case on those words right there.
Yeah. So your instrument was damaged. So not only was it not in calibration, but it wasn't even in a state of good repair. Seriously? The next words out of that attorney's mouth would be, Your Honor, motion to grant a summary judgment on this case in favor of my client based on the incompetence of the surveyor on the other side. Thank you very much. Case done, right? So your stuff's got to be good. And even to the point where your tripods have to be tight. The fittings of the feet on those tripods, those are your connection of your survey instrument to the world. And with the modern instruments, with their servos or their mag drives or whatever the technology is next, they put an incredible amount of torque on those tripods. And you will get random error generated even from tripods in good repair that maybe aren't the most torque resistant tripods. But if you got tripods with feet that are loose, or the head is a little bit loose, or the leg connections are a little sloppy, man, you're just throwing error into your system, okay? Use industry accepted procedures. Now, if in your region crappy procedures are accepted, that's not what I'm talking about, okay? Do things appropriately, right? Incorporate proper checks in your actions. Whatever it is you're doing, have a check. Who else is on the line that I can pick on? Who's willing to get picked on? I want to ask you a question about setting up your instrument and measuring your height of instrument. Nobody's volunteering.
You can pick on me, Rob, for sure.
Oh,
Come
Michael
on.
Hank. There you go. So, Mike, you set up your instrument. You use a folding rule to measure your HI.
Actually, I just set it up even with my eye, and I know how tall I am.
There you go.
And we don't have an OP on the gun, so we swing a bob still.
Okay. Well, back in the good old days, when you pull out that folding rule, and some people have the ones with the tenths on one side and inches on the other, but there's others that have metric on one side and tenths on the other, tenths and hundredths. So you measure it in tenths and hundredths and write that down, and then turn that rule around and measure it in meters. And then you do a quick conversion on the meters to make sure that you didn't either write down or misread the tenths and hundreds, because instrument HI is the most common blunder to be made. So figure out what procedures you have to do to meet the specifications before you even go to the field. And then take an adequate number of redundant measurements to help you meet those specs. And cross ties in a traverse. So if you had a traverse around a rectangular field and you just traverse the perimeter, hell, just shoot the diagonals while you're at it, okay? It'll help tighten up your network and identify any potential blunders. And we talked about strength of figure, bad network geometry. It can warp the network. So when you go to set up, oh, that's not right. That should say adjustment software. When you go to set up that software, when you're getting ready to start this particular adjustment of your data and downloading your data, you want to enter the appropriate instrument specifications and then enter the appropriate a priori error estimates. How much centering error do you have with your total station? How much centering errors at your backsites and foresights? Are you using tribrax where you can get that? Are you using well-adjusted tribrax where you can get that centering error down very small? Or are you working off of a prism pole that you also use to help pop lids on manholes, right? What you're trying to do is establish the expectations, okay? With these potential errors, this is what I expect as that total sum of all those different error sources combined. And here's the key. The adjustment software, it runs a two-part process. You do the unconstrained adjustment first, or the minimally constrained adjustment. And what you're really looking at is your observations and the observation weighting, and looking for any outliers, or looking for particularly high residuals. And you're really analyzing the entire network when you do that minimally constrained adjustment. Once you're happy with that unconstrained adjustment, you might actually go in and disable a set of measurements because something happened to that measurement set that it's way farther out than you'd expect it to be. Okay, so you disable that and rerun the minimally constrained adjustment. Once you're happy with the unconstrained, then you go ahead and go to the constrained. You place, and the result of that constrained adjustment is coordinate values on all points in the network. Now in the unconstrained or minimally constrained adjustment, sometimes this can be called a free adjustment. You use it to evaluate your observations and the weighting and the relationships of those observations. And you only fix or assign values to the minimum required number of points. This is where I'm screwed up. That slide that I had earlier, that's here, right? So you review your data and you produce your minimally constrained reports. And you don't have to kill a bunch of trees in this day and age. We can do that amazing thing called Adobe PDF. And then you're just killing electrons. But you go through and you store that report. Right? Then you run the constrained and produce the fully constrained reports. Now, sometimes something goes sideways. If you're unconstrained, all worked out good, then your data is probably good. And if it goes to a constrained adjustment and it blows up on you, your problem is in your control. Now think about that for a second. If all the measurement is working basically just tied to a single point, so everything just has to fit to itself. If it all works, your data is okay. But then if you bring in one other point and it starts tweaking things, or you bring in all the things that you're going to constrain to, all the control points you're going to constrain to, and it starts tweaking that setup, and your numbers go way out of whack, then you have a problem in the control network, okay? It could be that one of your control points got hit. And so what you do is you go back to that minimally constrained setup and you start adding constraints. Now, the worst case scenario is that the one that you started with in the minimally constrained adjustment is the one that got hit. Because as soon as you add one in, it's going to blow up on you, and you go, "Oh, that one's the problem," and then you're going to take that one out of the constraint solution, and you're going to bring in all your data, all your controlling monuments again, and you're going to run it, and it's going to blow up on you. So you just have to add one at a time, and then see where the problem jumps up. So these are the things that you analyze in the statistics. The standard deviation of unit weight. We'll get to, there's a slide on that. The observation residuals. What's the arithmetic mean? And what's your measurement? What's the difference? That's the observation residuals. You got to look for that. And coordinate standard deviations and error ellipses, that's a whole class on its own. But relative errors between points. How does this point compare to that point, right? The chi-square test is one that you should look at, but don't go back through and start changing your a priori estimates. If everything else looks good, but it fails the chi-square test, all right, it fails the chi-square test. Chi-square is an analysis of the statistics of the statistics. And if it passes, great. If it doesn't, but everything looks okay, go with it. Don't go back and start tweaking stuff to make it work. So this is standard deviation of unit weight, or standard error of unit weight. It can also be called error total or network reference factor. And here's the key. Remember I told you, hit the F5 key? And what you're looking for is the network reference factor to be 1 or close to 1. Okay. Well, how close to 1 is acceptable? Well, 0.9 to 1.1, that's a good range. But 0.8 to 1.2 might be okay. I don't have a good answer for this part. But here's the key. What this is telling you is if your network reference factor is less than 1, your observations are better than the a priori estimates that you put into the software. If you put in appropriate a priori estimates for a standard brand new instrument, but you've had this instrument for a year and it's about due for calibration, you're probably going to get a number slightly greater than 1. And your observations are not as good as your a priori estimates, your weighting. Observation residuals, right?
Hey, Rob, I think
Yo.
your screen stopped sharing. We're seeing you, not your slide.
Okay, hey everybody. Did we lose anybody? We even got Steve here still. All right. All right, let me do this again. Share screen 1, share. Are you seeing it again?
Yep, there you go. So the last slide we missed.
Okay. So, oh, missed out on some of the last slide?
Yeah, the last one we saw was try. Yeah, we missed out on that one because we had the
Okay.
try test before that.
Okay, so network reference factor or standard deviation of unit weight, standard error of the unit weight, right? If your number comes out greater than 1, then your observations are not as good as your weighting, as your a priori error estimates that you inserted. Maybe your rods aren't as plumb as you think they are, or maybe your tribrachs aren't, or maybe the instrument's not performing quite as well. Or maybe you're not performing quite as well. I'm feeling that kind of day today. I'm not on my A game, but hey, I'll bounce back tomorrow. I'll be down in the 0.9 range tomorrow, maybe even 0.8. So if you're less than 1, your observations are better than your weighting. So residuals, we talked about them earlier. That's the difference from your individual measurements or your measurement groups to the arithmetic mean of that measurement. You're looking at each observation in the residuals to make sure that you don't have a flyer. If you're using StarNet and even Trimble Business Center, it sets some kind of a flag that shows you, hey, there's a problem with this set of measurements. It might put them in red. It used to be like stars out to the side of StarNet. And if you have anything that's more than 3 times the observation's weight, then that's going to be flagged as an outlier. And back to this, large residuals may indicate blunders. And the blunder could be as simple as identifying to what point in the software you measured your height of instrument or your height of GPS antenna. So I guess on is it the S6 that has, you can either measure the HI to the optical axis, or you can measure it to the notch. And the notch is just a convenient spot on the instrument that you can get at with the tape or your folding rule. And you have to indicate that. And then the Trimble R10s, you're either measuring to a spot on the antenna on the housing, or you're measuring to some kind of adapter base. And it's about a 10 centimeter change. And when NGS did when we all participated in the national, basically crowdsourcing of GPS data, a lot of the errors were 10 centimeters from what they expected on a particular benchmarks, GPS on benchmarks campaign. And the problem was, and they found out that the ones that they were having this 10 centimeter error on were Trimble R10s. And they started asking questions and figured out that a whole bunch of data was corrupted because the wrong measurement point was input into the software when they did the analysis. So the amount of adjustment that gets applied to the observations to make this best fit, that's the key. That's the residual that we're trying to minimize. Remember the residuals squared, right? That's sum of the residuals squared being the least or minimized. That's where we're going with that stuff. So here's some reminders, and I'll bring it home right after this. Redundancy strengthens your adjustment. Error sources have to be determined correctly. And the least squares adjustment is a two-part system, a minimally constrained and then fully constrained, with analysis on both. So, I saw Joshua back there. Why do we care, Joshua? Your face came up on the screen, so now I'm going to pick on you. Why do we care about all this crap?
We want to be as accurate as we can be with our measurements.
Yeah? How about this? When we have good communication, everything turns out better, right? And that doesn't mean, that can be applied to in the workplace, at home with our kids or our spouses, with our best friend when we're out drinking, with our best enemy when we're out drinking, right? Anywhere, in any condition, good communication should lead to better results. So, statistics is the language that the instrument speaks. In order to understand what our measurements are telling us, we have to be fluent or at least conversant in statistics. I didn't invent that. One of my extremely talented colleagues, Dave Olander, said, "This is the way I think about this." And I went, wow, that is exactly it. That is the reason why we need to understand this stuff and how to apply it. So, what do you think?
May I add, Rob, to the question you just asked Joshua, coming from experience both good and bad in court, that another reason why we care is you really want to be able to defend yourself when you're taken to court and ask these critical questions.
You bet. You bet. And just because we come up with some numbers that say this. Let's see if I can get back out of here. Stop share. So since Steve's chimed in about being in court, a statistical analysis of what you have done gets you to a certain point, but following the laws of boundary and evidence and documenting what you've done out there, it beats smoke and mirrors every day, right? It's that classic situation of, if you have 2 points, right, or 3 points that you found in the field, and you position them and you put coordinates on them, and you run a best fit line through that set of 3 points, you're going to be hard pressed to convince me that that best fit line is the boundary if you've got solid monuments to work off of, right? So don't ignore the laws of boundary to accept the laws of statistics. Michael Hank, Raul Moreno.
I just noticed a big pause in the room after you said that. It's like, oh crap, that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years.
Yeah, well, I know that some of us haven't been doing that, but Trent, what do you got to say about that?
No, it was, the whole thing was good. You know,
All right.
I like what you presented. I love I love your analogies. Sometimes it's fun.
Can I chime in one more time, Rob?
Steve, you are welcome to at any time.
Anytime.
Oop,
I'm
you're
trying to
fading
see
out.
where this book's going to come. It's not coming up well. Anyway, A.C. Mulford.
Mulford.
Boundaries and landmarks. So we
Yeah.
talk all about the precision that we're doing things. But are we accurate? Are we on the right spot? So we're getting back to the very basics of what surveying isn't. It isn't that it's all about that, but it starts there with the monuments.
Yeah.
And I would rather go to court with some inaccurate measurements between the right monuments than go to court having occupied the wrong monuments with high precision. And I'd rather be embarrassed about my measurements than embarrassed about having the wrong basic data that I started from on the ground.
Everybody write that down.
A.C. Mulford is just absolutely just something that's thought-provoking. I see it's not coming up on the screen well, but anyway, the 1909 A.C. Mulford, Boundaries and Landmarks, and it can be found right online.
Oh, nice.
It's 1912. I apologize, not 1909, 1912.
I have the link already in when I send it out, the follow-up
I
email.
sound like an old timer there, but I've used that for the 12 years I taught at Great Basin. The students were required to read that and give me their impressions on what they thought about that 1912 bit of information.
100%. 100% on point. So, what do you guys think? Take a few minutes, talk about what you think.
Hey, Rob, this is Raul.
Hola,
This
señor.
was, hola, señor. This was a really good class as usual. So, quick question: is there a way? I missed the first part, the one for the last week. So, is there a way that I can get that. I don't know if you have like the video record or the presentation. So is there a way to download that those presentations?
Yeah, Trent says that it's been recorded, and I'll do a PDF of this presentation and kick it out to Trent also. And that's the good news. The bad news is, Raul, since you're a new Caltrans employee, you're going to get this for 8 hours in the near future.
Okay.
So
I'm happy with that, believe me.
So if 3 hours was painful enough, maybe that's not a good recruiting tool, is it, Mr. Hank? You get eight hours worth of this at some point in the future. So Kat, what Liam have to say about this?
He was shouting out all the answers as you were teaching us.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, it's a good one.
That's good.
Smart one.
Well, there's where are you located? Arizona?
We're in Florida, Orlando, Florida.
Okay.
Yep. Were you gonna say something?
When you were talking about the angles, how the angles equal exactly 180 degrees with the seconds and minutes. By seconds and minutes, do you mean the fractions of the angle?
That is correct.
Technically, an angle is split up into 360 degrees, and each of those is split up into 60 more which are minutes, and then those split up into 60. And so when you're off by 30 seconds, it was really 1/60th of a 60th times 30.
Okay, I have a question for you. How come you understand a concept that we sometimes have challenges explaining to engineers?
I know.
No offense to my engineer colleagues out there, but right. It's so a 360-degree circle.
Mm-hmm.
And where's my little pointer thing? Right, 360-degree circle, and that's right. Each degree can be split up into 60 minutes, and each minute, just as in hours, minutes, and seconds, can be split again into 60. Right?
In the angles, instead of calling degrees, it's sometimes also called arc, as in the arc of a circle, right?
We normally talk about them as angles because of the conceptual way that we measure them. But yes, it's an arc of a circle. Yeah.
Cool.
Liam, what are you going to be presenting for us in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this, man. How old is this kid?
How old's Liam?
11.
He's
Wow.
11.
All right, so where are you going to go to school to study surveying when you get to be 14?
I don't know.
He's going to be a Florida Gator.
Yeah.
Right?
You do have a true gift that a lot of people, Rob was kind of joking about engineers and others not getting it, but you really do have a gift to visualize mathematics. That's not something that most people have. And so hopefully you can find something in your life. If it's surveying, I hope so. For me, it was. But something that you can leverage that gift and find something that's just really rewarding to you. You might wind up being an orthopedic surgeon. You might wind up being an astronaut or a geophysicist or something. But you do have a gift at a very young age that most people don't ever acquire throughout their long life. So good for you.
Thank you.
That's awesome,
Pretty
buddy.
impressive.
It is impressive.
And hey, we got Sharon on. Sharon's on with us today.
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Yeah.
Mark Nolan.
Derek was
Sully.
on earlier. Derek was on. He jumped off. Hey, Sean Bannon, you had sent me an email. Maybe now's a good time to ask that question. if he jumped off. Where'd he go? He sent me a question about errors and ellipse, Rob, and I'll forward you Sean's email.
Oh, dude, that's okay. Yeah, forward it to me, but
yeah,
it's brutal.
Yep. He must have stepped away, but that's another subject for another week for sure.
All right, sending you the PDF with its included errors.
And then Raul, you'll be on this follow-up email, and inside there will be a Dropbox link to all of the prior weeks, and that's where you can find the prior handouts and the prior videos for weeks 2, 3, and 4. So.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Last week, the link that you sent was for a zip folder, and
okay.
To open it, you have to download like all of those gigs of data.
Okay.
If you can somehow make it like a folder that one can pick from, that would be great.
Yep, I'll find a way to do that. Got it. No worries.
See, we're getting mentored here too.
That's right. The growing pains.
So, all right, I got a thumbs up from Norma. That's good. And Luz, how you doing? Did you make it home safely?
Yeah, I made it home, made it to work. So I was watching you, and it was great presentation.
Okay. Did I teach you anything that you didn't already learn from Fresno State?
Yeah, the last part about the courts. I don't think I learned that in college, so that was great.
Okay. Well, I got 5:32 on the clock. What do you guys think?
There you go.
Beer 30?
Next week we'll be JC Moore doing some ALTA presentation stuff, so that'll be fun. He's an entertaining speaker, so that'll be fun.
Yeah, Jay's kick. He was with us first week, I think.
Yep.
So,
cool.
Steve, as always, thank you for your contributions, and thank you everyone for participating. Michael, Raul, Luz, Kat, Liam,
that's right.
Jocelyn. Hey, wait a second. Wasn't this your request?
Yeah.
And you've been conspicuously silent.
Yeah.
I'm absorbing it all. Taking good notes. I think after the first week when I requested it, you guys had sent materials too. So I've been studying, and this was definitely a good refresher. It's nice to hear it versus just reading it. So I appreciate that.
Okay.
Good. Did you get your did you get your test date figured out?
I had to move locations, so still October 27th, but I'm in Bakersfield now. So
okay.
Cool. A little bit of
Bakersfield.
Yeah. Hopefully they don't close Bakersfield.
And you could have come to San Diego.
Yeah. I want to sleep in my own bed the night before the test.
Oh yeah, there is that.
Yeah.
Kent?
Yeah.
Kent's here. What do you think,
It was all good. I like it. It disproves the error. It takes any possible error out of all the measurements, right? So yeah. I don't know. It kind of, I'm not sure how to put it. Really, just it disproves any error, I guess. So yeah, I like it.
Well, it appropriately, from a statistical concept, it appropriately distributes the error, so that, think about if you did some kind of fancy 10-point network with a bunch of measurements all over the place, right? And you come up with values, just your raw field values. If you started out and just said, okay, I'm at 10,000, 20,000, and I'm picking this as north, and here's this coordinate, here's that coordinate, right? Whatever that raw set of values are to your final values, and then take the residuals between the raw values and the final values and square those and add them all up so that that number is the smallest possible number. one thing I didn't mention is that the least squares, as it goes through its processes, it goes through what it calls iterations. And it assumes, it makes some assumptions in the software and says, all right, what if I do this? What happens? Right? And, you know, what if I take my friends' kids out for a day in the park and then I bring them back and give them jumbo Snickers bars and a big gulp Coke just before I drop them off, right? How's that going to work, right? It's not, right? Your friends are going to go, don't ever take my kids out after. What did you do to my kids? They were off the walls when they got back here, right? It goes through these iterations, and what it's trying to do is minimize the total adjustment in the whole network. The sum of all of the differences, trying to make that the smallest possible number. So,
what's the use of CBLs anywhere else in the country for your total stations, based on the fact that instrument shops are using such a short baseline when we get out in the field and you're measuring 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, and your scale error starts coming into your EDM measurements? Are folks still using calibrated baselines? I know in Georgia, I spent a year with NGS recertifying and setting up new baselines about 5 years ago.
Nice.
with their equipment, and then went back up to Virginia and actually processed all of them, which was entertaining in that aspect of all the old buildings they have up there. They're just full of old survey. They had old 5600 robots, brand new, that they bought 20 of them and didn't know what they bought them for, that were just sitting in a warehouse.
Sweet.
But
how did you like the T2000 with the DI2000 Distomat?
I loved it, and in all honesty, we were still using those for our dam deformation surveys.
Yeah.
At the same time, about 5-6 years ago, until we ended up with 4 of them that we ended up using for spare parts.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't repair them anymore. But I would take those back over in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Just for the ease of operation in all reality.
Yeah, my 2002 and DI 1600 were stolen about, I don't know, 5 years ago or something.
Jeez.
And man, it broke my heart.
Oh yeah.
You know, yeah, it was about 10 years ago that I got a chance, maybe only 8 or so, to work with NGS and do establish a new calibration baseline in the Sacramento area. And when we started doing the measurements, so let's see, for those of you that are fairly new to surveying, like less than 20 years, you might not be familiar with the old Leica Vild and then Leica T2000, T2002 line of instruments, and the other T1600, T1000. The survey instrument and the distance meter were 2 separate pieces that clipped together. And you had to make sure that the optics of the instrument and the infrared emitter of the T2000, of the Distomat, the DI 1600 or DI 1000, DI 2000, whatever it was, were aligned properly. Otherwise, you'd pull your crosshairs onto a target and you wouldn't get a very good signal return, or you might not get any signal return. And the NGS advisor at the time out here had done several baselines, and it took them forever to do them because they had to pull off and try and hunt for that signal peak. And I used one of those here with Caltrans from 1990 to 2000, you know, day in, day out, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week. And I said, look, I'd like to calibrate this, and she wasn't too keen on. I said, I'd like to align your axes so that we can do this more quickly. She wasn't too keen on that, and she said, well, I'd have to call the equipment guy back in Corbin or wherever the heck it was in the East Coast. And so I went to my truck and I pulled out my manual for the 2002 and brought it over and said, this is what I'm going to do. Get the guy on the phone. And I got a hold of him. She got a hold of him. She handed me the phone. And I said, yeah, that's what I want to do because it's not aligned right. Oh, do you know how to do that? Yeah, you use the Allen screw. You do this, you look for the signal peak. And he's like, oh, you've done this before? Yeah, only about 150 times, over the course of 10 years. So, yeah, do it. So we were able to finish our observations in one day instead of 2 up there. But yeah, a lot of fun, and I think it's important to go out and do real world testing on a baseline, and make a note of that in a field book that goes with that instrument. And also have the calibrations done, because they're doing that calibration and they're checking the, I guess they're checking the wavelengths of the signals that are generated. And it's all electronic and it should work out fine, but
it's all merit based. I mean, the guns need to go to the shop and be calibrated, and we had requirements with the power company that all equipment was calibrated every 6 months, and you had to provide us the reports of how your equipment fared. And I mean, we had 10, 12 crews run off because they weren't running the reports and calibrating equipment. And we had a couple condemnation cases that we lost because the crews didn't have calibration records, because the opposing counsel knew it was a requirement that we calibrated at the baselines every 6 months.
And it didn't make a hill of beans a difference to what you did, except that you didn't meet the spec.
Because multiple crews, we retraced all their work and had the exact same answer, but because of that one instance, it went downhill with young counsel for the power company and then a very smart older attorney.
Yep. Hey, so for you young people out there, and for me, that's anybody under about 50 these days, but I'll say definitely anybody under 40.
Yep.
Old age and treachery beats youth and enthusiasm 9 times out of 10.
Yep.
So, Trent sent me the question from Sean Bannon, and yeah, that's intense. He's a math guy.
Yeah, he's a math guy. Exactly.
Yeah.
Sean, are you back on here yet? Nope, he must have stepped off.
I'm not seeing
Yeah, that's going to be, that's another week, another subject.
Yeah. Wow. I know who could, I'm a math guy, and this is like, nah, I'm not up for this.
That's what I thought when I read it too.
He's so excited.
But I know a guy that's a math guy.
He perked right up when he heard math.
Yeah, Liam. Okay, Liam, check it out. So this guy wrote, I don't know if this is practical because I don't know what kind of equipment is available, because he's relatively new to surveying but has good math. But he was wondering if you could find an accurate horizontal measurement with an ellipse model instead of a triangle or discrete measurement. Ellipses are cool when all the rays from one foci reflects to the other, and that distance is always the same.
Yeah. That's
how you
find
he says. Yeah,
that's how you
says.
find an ellipse.
Right, okay. So for any 3 points, you could set 2 points as a foci and then create a theoretical ellipse whose curve would pass through the 3rd point. Then on that third point, if there's a reflective surface with the right curvature, any measurement from one foci off that curve to the other foci would be the same. Of course it would. This seems like it would allow for continuous measurement, which theoretically means you could take an infinite amount of measurements along that curve, reducing the error to zero, which, yes, that is correct.
Right.
Right? I don't know if this is practical because it would mean that the curved surface would have to have very little error. Ah, there's the key. And I don't know if there's anything where the reflected measurement is something is accurate. Well, that's what we deal with. Yeah. Yeah. Does it make sense to use an ellipse this way for some horizontal measurements, or am I just trying to assume too much and what I'm saying isn't really practical or effective? It seems like the biggest problem with error is that it's discrete and limited. We hope it is. And would this help make a system that allows for continuous measurements? Yeah, the questions are, do you like Switzerland or do you like New Zealand?
You know,
the stuff seems out there, but you remember we started with a chain and then went to a steel tape, and then some really smart person came up with, hey, let's use infrared light off a prism to measure a distance. And before that, the guy was using microwaves, but he didn't live too long. You know, he was in. But
yeah.
We did the steel chain and plumb bob. Can you see the chain? Yep. And then we have a point on our.
Wait, you're measuring flat. What are you doing?
Well, hang on. That was just to show them.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see down the parking lot, the other crew.
Yeah, it looks like they're measuring flat. They got no catenary in the tape.
Hang on. Well, this is an old chain too. It was an old chain just to show them the exercise of how to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
And we got a good. Now he knows to stand up tall, but he's got a nice plumb bob. There it is.
Nice.
It's not good. I think it's is it 16?
16 ounce or an 18 ounce?
Yes,
yeah.
that's the one, 16.
Nice.
So it was a fun exercise, and the guys loved learning it. And we measured it the night before so that we'd have the answer for the morning, and they were different because it was in the heat of the day and the coolness in the morning. So we learned about the difference of the chain stretching or expanding. So
there
you go. Coefficient of linear expansion, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one thing, if I could, from an experience several years back that will date me again.
Please.
We had a job in the middle fork of the Salmon River to go in, and the river ran right through two sections that had been surveyed by the General Land Office. We needed to subdivide that. There was private land in there, and there was a homestead entry survey. We flew all our equipment and our gas and everything in with a fixed wing on a real back country airport that I won't even talk about landing there. And then we brought in a helicopter so we'd get back and forth across the river. I had just received 2 weeks before a brand new HP 3820. And I had 2 weeks to learn how to use it. I still took in my T2 and my HP 3800 and my HP calculator. And so we set up the first traverse, checked things out, and the T2 3800, we were missing by several tenths of a foot in our measurements and so forth from the 3820. Well, one individual with us, we had 4 surveyors in there and about 3 other assistants in there because it was a good sized job and a lot of labor to it, monumentation and the whole thing. One surveyor got deep into the manual of the 3820 and found out that it corrected for curvature and refraction. So as soon as we applied the raw data from the 3800 T2 and applied curvature and refraction, we were coming in within hundredths of a foot of our measurements between those two. Now, I've been a long ways away from today's and the last decade or two of equipment. I'm going to just ask, I assume that today's equipment automatically takes care of curvature and refraction on the longer distances when it starts to make a difference? I'm looking for a yay out there. Or,
yes, it does. But like most things, people have to know to go into the settings and make sure that that's enabled. Yeah. So I visited my dad in Chicago to help out with a little topo at the BP Amoco research facility. And I'm like, well, I'll run the instrument for you guys. You guys have been putting in your work for my dad. I'll help you out. I'll run the instrument. And I look down at the screen on the Leica instrument, and it's got like a square with an X through it. Now, I don't know what that symbol means, but anything with an X through it is not usually good. But as they were walking away, I pulled a book out, and sure enough, it was the tilt compensator that they had disabled somehow. And I'm like, you know, you guys are shooting topo. The compensator is kind of a nice tool to have enabled when you're doing that. If it's okay with you, I'll turn it back on. You know, so you got a beautiful piece of equipment, and yet the operator just didn't understand how to properly use it. So again, hats off to your colleague for understanding how to use their equipment by reading the manual. What an idea.
Yeah.
Nice.
Some of the people on the screen know my colleague Annette Hovorka. She was CLSA president last year, and Annette told me she did most of her field work in the area of Stockton, California, which is a lovely garden spot in the Central Valley. And summers generally are up in the 110 to 120 degree range. Winters can be in the 40s during the day, but mostly nicer than that. But she was doing some retracement, and as Steve mentioned, the instrument wasn't matching up with what they were expecting to find when they were measuring between 16th corners. So they're looking for 1320s approximately, and they kept missing the record measurements from this particular surveyor that had done the original surveying back in the days of transit and tape, or theodolite and tape. And what somebody had mentioned was, or what she said is, you know, when we measure this, we typically are missing him by about 1/10 and maybe to 1500ths, which isn't terrible. We're finding his marks, we're finding his monuments, but we're not hitting his measurements as well as I would have expected. And she had the thought to go back to the historical records from the date of the survey and see when he did the work, and then apply the temperature from that date to his measurements, and they were hitting 1320s for 100th or two once you applied a temperature correction. And what they found is in when they retraced this guy's work, some months they were right on the money, and that was usually, well, there's this amazing time in the Central Valley that's a week where the temperature is just perfect. They call that spring. And then in the fall, there's also that week or maybe 2 or 3 that's really nice, and they call that autumn. But then the rest, it's either cold and nasty or hot and nasty. And they were either short or long or right on the money, depending on when in the year. And they realized that this particular surveyor never corrected for temperature on his shading. So one way to identify a reoccurring error, it's a systematic error. So, hey, with that, let's call it a night.
Yeah, I was just going to say your alarm's about.
Yeah, I just looked down, saw 5:55. It's like, hey, we talked for 30 minutes after I stopped.
Exactly. Cool. Okay, I'll send out the email like
All
I
right,
always do. So if you guys don't get it, just let me know. But it'll have the links and the highlights for the books and that kind of stuff. So
Thanks, everybody. Hope you had fun.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good
Thanks,
night.
guys.
Bye, guys.
Have a
Thank
good one.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.